Great, I think we'll begin, everyone. So, good morning, everyone. It's really nice to see so many of you here so early in the day. My name's Mark Hallett. I'm Director of Studies here at the Centre. I'd like to welcome you all to this one-day conference addressing the issue of connoisseurship. Now, this is a topic upon which I've been mulling about for quite some time now, and I hope she forgives me mentioning this, but I remember talking to Professor Liz Pretjohn over a late evening glass of wine quite a few years ago now, about what we both recognised was a resurgence of interest in the formal and material properties of the art object on the part of our fellow academic art historians, and an increasing willingness on their part to address and explore the distinctive stylistic characteristics of an individual artist's work. And we were wondering whether this trend in the discipline might even be described as the emergence of a new connoisseurship. And agreed that a conference, and this was a few years ago, we never really did anything about it that quickly, did we, Liz? That a conference on the topic of connoisseurship itself, a term that is notoriously slippery and prone to misunderstanding, would be very welcome. And in some ways, today's events, I think, do have their origins in that conversation. And Liz, of course, will be giving a keynote lecture later this afternoon. But the more immediate stimulant for today's event, however, was a meeting that my colleague Martin Possel and I held here at the Centre last year, in which we gathered together a group of professionals from the art trade and sounded at them out about the issues that they thought deserved further scholarly investigation and analysis, part of a series of meetings we had with a whole group of different kind of constituencies from the art world, from the art historical world. And it quickly became clear not only that connoisseurship was at the top of their list, but also that there was a great deal of anxiety on their part about what they saw as the withering away or dismissal of such skills in the university and even in the curatorial sectors. And having recently moved to the Mellon from a university history of art department that placed close looking at the art object at the centre of much of its activities, and having worked closely over many years with colleagues in museums and galleries who engage with the art object on a daily basis, I have to say I was quite surprised, even startled, by the strength and the passion with which this argument was advanced by the auctioneers and dealers gathered around our table here. For them it was clear, and I'm very pleased to say that one of their number, Ben Grosvenor, will be speaking later this morning, connoisseurship was a crucial form of art historical expertise that was in danger of being lost, partly due to the fact that such expertise was no longer being inculcated in universities or even encouraged or given its proper due within museums. Now, as someone who thinks that the study of British art has been enormously enriched by the development of what's been described as a new art history. It's no longer new, this was in the 80s and 90s, I guess, that pays close attention to the social and cultural conditions under which works of art were produced and consumed. But also thinks that this new art history, or that kind of art history, has often paid too little attention to the formal complexity, the visual logic and the material properties of the art object itself. I was enormously stimulated by this discussion. And the same was true, I know, of Martin. And the two of us together agreed that the time was ripe for an event that began the process of thinking anew about connoisseurship and about its contribution and relevance to studies in British art in particular, both historic and contemporary. So, Martin and I, working together closely with our new Assistant Director of Research, Sarah Turner, and our events coordinator, Ella Fleming, thus spent quite a bit of time discussing how such an event might be structured. And we concluded that it would be best to ask a mixture of art dealers, museum curators, conservators and academics to give personal position papers based on their own professional perspectives on and experiences of connoisseurship. And the topics and questions that we invited our speakers to think about exploring and that we hope might be touched upon in our broader discussions today include the issue of whether connoisseurship can be taught, and if so, how are such skills learnt, developed and communicated, the issues of the overlaps between connoisseurship, technical knowledge and conservation, as well as conversation. The role of connoisseurship in the marketplace, the relationships between connoisseurship and collecting, between connoisseurship and art theory, and between connoisseurship and art history as an academic discipline. We'd also like to think about the ways in which connoisseurship is tied to issues of class and gender, and identify what might be described, if we find them, as connoisseurship's blind spots as a form of art historical investigation. So I'm extremely pleased to report that our plans for today's conference met with a really wonderful response. We have, I'm sure you'll agree, an extremely distinguished lineup of speakers drawn from various sectors of the art world. We're also pleased to have attracted such a large and interesting audience, I have to say. And recognising this, we've tried to build in plenty of time for discussion into today's proceedings. I'd urge you all, or as many of you as we can fit in, to get involved in what we expect will be a highly stimulating debate on the subject. And that's very much the atmosphere, the mood and the atmosphere that we would like to create today, a mood of discussion, of openness, of conversation, of questioning. And so it would be great if as many of you could get involved as possible. And as I think all of you will now be aware, partly because of the kit that's assembled in the back of this library, we're also filming and recording today's proceedings. Tickets for today's conference sold out within just a few days of being advertised. So we thought it would be a good idea to stream this event online. And this will also enable those watching on their laptops or their PCs or taking a minute or two from their work to submit questions to our speakers via Sarah Turner, who's moderating proceedings online. We should add an extra dimension to our discussion, I hope. So we have a really exciting day in prospect. For those of you gathered here, I can also promise a nice lunch at 12:30 and a drinks reception at 5. And for those of you watching from afar, I hope that today's talks and conversations, even when enjoyed on a virtual basis, provide plenty of nourishment and stimulation in their own right. So, I'd like now to invite my colleague Martin Postle to the podium. Martin, who will be chairing our first session this morning, is the Deputy Director of Studies here at the Centre and an internationally respected authority on 18th century British art, published prolifically in that area. But also, as all of you will know, he's someone who has famously possessed an especially sensitive and knowledgeable eye. So, all in all then, the perfect person to get us started. Thanks very much indeed. All right.
Well, good morning everybody, and a very warm welcome. It's my great pleasure to kick proceedings off this morning by introducing the first speaker, Dr. Stephen Deuchar, who is Director of the Art Fund. Stephen joined the Art Fund about 4 years ago, in January 2010. But before that, as you all know, he was the founding director of Tate Britain. He joined in 1998 and stayed until December 2009. And our trajectories at the Tate, I think, coincided quite closely. I was also there for most of that period, and it was a very exciting and challenging time in the Tate's history. Before working at the Tate, Stephen was a curator and exhibitions director at the National Maritime Museum, where he was deeply involved in the transformation of the museum. He was educated in Southampton, London and Yale, and he has a strong interest in 18th century art, but also increasingly in contemporary art. So Stephen's going to speak for about 30-35 minutes, and that will allow us about 10 minutes for vigorous questioning, okay? And that'll take us to coffee. So Stephen, if you'd like to come to the podium, and the subject is Connoisseurship Now, Connoisseurship Live, some thoughts.
Thank you, Martin. Mark invited me to start this day off by making some, as he put it, informal and personal remarks on the subject of connoisseurship, or as I interpret this more precisely, on the issue of connoisseurship's current status in the world of art, by which I mean that very diverse set of people across many constituencies, which are actually very far from making up any kind of a homogeneous group or community at all. University academics, school art teachers, art history students, fine art students, artists, museum curators, museum educators, art critics, art journalists, general art book writers, TV pundits, dealers, auctioneers, collectors, the list goes on. And I think I can spot representatives of many of those constituencies in the room here today. And although to make one very obvious point, many individuals will, of course, belong to more than one of those categories, in some instances several at once, it's certainly true that the diversity of motivation here is so wide that there seems little or no possibility of finding a single art world view on anything at all, least of all what it is about connoisseurship that does or doesn't matter. But on the subject of the value of connoisseurship to their own particular area, each constituency, I think, actually probably does know best. It's the groups that want to preach to the others that cause the problems. As I must admit, I'm rather hoping we may see today. There is certainly plenty to disagree about. In fact, I expect to see today quite a lot of subjectivity dressed up as objectivity, and I'll try to set the tone now by doing exactly that myself. As I mentioned, some of the ways in which I've seen the issue of the status of connoisseurship from my various vantage points over the past 30 or so years, that terrible progression from young Turk to old fogey, which afflicts so many of us. My own particular vantage points have been in this order: history undergraduate, art history postgraduate, museum curator, exhibitions organiser, museum director, art charity director. Not actually an especially broad range in professional terms, it has to be said. I've led a very sheltered and privileged life. But certainly broad enough to bring me into frequent contact with pretty much all of the art world constituencies I mentioned a moment ago. And as an unashamed advocate of the broad church, I've generally enjoyed the sometimes vehement diversity of views on the key question of what it is in the end that makes a work of art valuable, that complex and contentious issue that ultimately lies behind the subject under discussion today. No doubt many of today's speakers will have a go at defining connoisseurship. The word clearly doesn't have a simple single meaning, and its connotations are actually almost limitless. For me, it means, firstly, factual knowledge about the work of art. That might include, above all, who made it, when and where, for whom, in what circumstances. It might also encompass knowledge about comparative works, either by the artist or by other artists. And of course, it might incorporate matters of provenance as well. It can also mean categorizing and explaining the physical works of a work, the physical appearance of the work of art in terms of its structure, technique, and style. And connoisseurship is also, I think, understood widely to mean the ostensible exercise of aesthetic judgment, enabling the declaration that something is good, bad, or indifferent in terms of artistic quality, a subscription to the idea, which for me I have to say is a slightly dubious one, that such things have absolute independent worth, whatever the era or geographical or cultural milieu, and thereby the placing of the work of art somewhere into that hierarchy which used unashamedly to be called taste. Now, it hardly needs to be pointed out that connoisseurship, whilst implying knowledge, understanding, discernment of quality, and so on, has also picked up weighty associations with class and with gender, as Mark mentioned. For example, the habitual visual caricature of the connoisseur in British art from the 18th century to the present day involves specific or implied references to wealth, breeding, and of course maleness. We're not talking about a connoisseurs, we're talking about a connoisseur. In terms of the popular perception in the late 20th century, such caricature was famously helped along and possibly enshrined in the sight and sound of Kenneth Clarke, the BBC series Civilization. Although I think we all know that that should be seen actually in a much wider orbit than the mere history of connoisseurship, as I suspect the forthcoming Tate Britain exhibition on Kenneth Clarke will succeed in doing. Not to mention the proposed remake by the BBC, in which I gather Janet Street Porter is now the lead contender to be Kenneth Clarke's successor, which I would certainly support wholeheartedly. Now, coming as I did from being a history undergraduate to an art history postgraduate, we're talking about 1979 or 80, I think, this discipline, if it may be so called, of connoisseurship was both impressive to me and in truth slightly baffling. By comparison with history, mainstream history of art seemed to me to be both slightly scary, all those self-confident connoisseurs with evidently divine visual skills pronouncing on works of art, and also unexpectedly unambitious, never looking very far beyond the narrow focus to ask not just what an object was, but why it really mattered and what it told us about the world. At my most pessimistic, I wondered whether what I saw as the connoisseurial obsession with small detail, small difference, rendered it any different from stamp collecting or train spotting or wine or classic car connoisseurship, those curiously seductive and comforting worlds of minutiae in which whether something really counts in the bigger scheme of things never really gets to be asked, because the enthusiasts are so absorbed in a kind of orgy of their own expertise. Certainly my own choice of research topic back then, 18th century British sporting art, came about, I need hardly say, not through any personal impulse of connoisseurial attraction to the subject, notwithstanding the tremendous charms of George Stubbs, but because I was specifically interested in how art of such generally low connoisseurial repute could have played a meaningful part in the lives of the wealthy and socially elevated people who originally commissioned and acquired it. It was also an anti-connoisseurial starting point, now I look back on it, and made the concurrent emergence of the new art history, for me, a highly welcome and exciting phenomenon. I was unashamedly delighted by the upset caused in the world of British art history by the likes of John Barrell and David Salkin in the first wave, the complacency of old art historians in universities and most curators in museums, severely disrupted by a movement rooted in the left, which refused to consider works of art devoid of their cultural and political contexts, and which, it seemed to me, introduced a wholly new level of intellectual rigor to a subject that had become almost crippled by self-satisfaction. It's true that in the polarizing clashes that took place between the art historians of the new and the old variety in those years, and remember we're looking at the kind of era, the very confrontational era of high Thatcherism at this point, connoisseurship was an habitual target, or some would say victim, carrying and even further developing associations with the politics of the right in its shrill denial that works of art could be meaningfully understood beyond their aesthetic value, and with the associated lament that new art history was not merely out to spoil the fun and enjoyment of art, but even somehow to undermine and break down the societies in which art flourished. There was certainly a sense in that battle between new and old art history, or at another level between academics and connoisseurs, that much more than mere art was at stake. And when, in the mid-1980s, I took up my first proper job as a curator of paintings at the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich, I think I saw it as a kind of obligation or badge of honour that I should try to introduce into the displays and exhibitions programme a way of treating art that suggested its importance beyond rather than within the physical reality of the works. What do they mean being much more interesting to me than who are they by? Now, this rather central idea of prioritising image over object was of course a good deal less controversial at Greenwich, where art had been collected for generations as much for its ostensible informational value, an illustration of that ship type or this battle commander or stretch of coastline, though I frequently did run foul of those curators who felt possessively, it seemed to me, that maritime art should be somehow protected from academics who wanted to read too much into innocent images. And I remember particularly a small curatorial rebellion against a little thing I published about a posthumous portrait of Nelson, which I argued was a kind of a form of recruitment propaganda for the Navy, which of course it was, but they didn't accept that. At the Tate, of course, which I observed at that stage from afar throughout the 1980s and 90s, the temperature was meanwhile very much higher. The famous furore over the Richard Wilson exhibition in 1982 led to a battening down of the hatches, to use a maritime metaphor, and a determined effort to, quote, keep the new art history at bay, which was pretty much policy when I arrived there myself as director of the Tate Gallery of British Art project in 1998. It struck me then, as now, interesting that the scars of a furore nearly more than 15 years earlier at that point should still have had such a profoundly constraining effect on the exhibition and display ambitions of the institution, leading it anachronistically to resist a phenomenon, the social history of art, that had by that time elsewhere almost become the orthodoxy. The largely connoisseur-based art history practiced by most curators up to the late 1990s was, in all honesty, spectacularly far removed, both from the kind of art history by then being taught in all UK universities, and also the kind that was slowly filtering through to the general public through general art books, which were of course being written by recent art history graduates. For in academic circles, narrow connoisseurship had become somewhat discredited, and those university departments that wholly resisted change were both few and conspicuous. Meanwhile, Tate exhibitions and displays, as was indeed the case with the presentation of art in most UK museums, adhered a little defiantly to older, less academic, more connoisseurial approaches to art. Most exhibitions were monographic, celebratory, and resistant to the revelations of new academic scholarship in which the object was not the end game, but the starting point for inquiry. In the couple of years leading up to the opening of the newly constituted Tate Britain, which happened in two phases, 2000 and 2001, and across the subsequent decade, I felt my responsibility was, in a way, in an institution where connoisseurship had shaped institutional culture, to create in parallel stronger links with a world of newer kinds of art history that had in truth now become the norm, and not the rebellious and subversive agent of change so apparently feared by some of the curators. And thus began a sequence of exhibitions in which we invited university art historians and historians who were emphatically not principally connoisseurs by definition, to contribute to exhibitions, to write for catalogues, or to co-curate them, often working alongside in-house colleagues. Examples would be Andrew Hemingway working on a show of the Norwich School, Michael Phillips and Marilyn Butler working on William Blake, Stephen Bann on Anglo-French romantic art, right up to Kevin Sharp working alongside Karen Hearn on Van Dyck. There were plenty of variants to that formula. Artist Richard Deacon and Philip Lindley working on medieval sculpture in 2001, Tim Hyman and Patrick Wright on Spencer, Martin Myrone and Mike Rosenthal, young and old versions of a broadly new wave on Gainsborough, and David Salkin, Ian Worrell and others on Turner and the Masters in 2009, all big crowd pullers, I may say. By 2009, the idea of bringing in academic historians and art historians to work on popular Tate Britain shows had become very far from unusual, almost commonplace, and the sense that I'd felt on arrival of an institution defending connoisseurial values against academic onslaught had really disappeared. Oddly, but certainly helped along with tangible impetus by the phenomenon of Tate Modern, where the thematic, the conceptual, the cross-disciplinary, the democratic, some would say the populist, were becoming the tenets of a powerful new brand. And yet in essence, at one level at least, this was all completely compatible with connoisseurial traditions of revering the object rather than merely admiring the image. I don't know how long these connoisseurial values can be upheld actually in the field of contemporary art, and I hope this is something that will be discussed by others later today. But they do seem to coexist very readily with the belief that the value of art today does lie far beyond aesthetic considerations alone, for example within cultural, psychological, or political terrain. Such ideas, even to the wealthiest, almost socially ambitious collecting classes who a decade or so ago might have resisted such notions fiercely, are quite standard. Indeed, in the field of contemporary art, are almost a new form of connoisseurship in themselves. And yet there is, of course, no steady, inexorable progress, no certain path in which one way of thinking about the importance of art absolutely supersedes another. Rather, there are cycles, as the changing fashion in art museum displays for either so-called thematic or chronological structures tends to demonstrate. You might argue that the thematic display is an inherently non-connoisseurial way of exploring art, in which the importance of the individual object is secondary to its contribution to the understanding of the world about it, and that the chronological display resists the liberties of interpretation and promotes instead a more controlled notion of the work of art first and foremost as a self-contained entity. What both approaches have in common, however, is a commitment to stimulate the museum visitor, and the rising importance of the visitor, the general consumer of art, that frightening person with their own expectations, rights and opinions, may well be a greater challenge to the primacy of connoisseurship in museums as well as to its academic opposites than any other single phenomenon. In my museum past, I was indeed a strong advocate of interpretation, of overtly apparent curatorial opinion of texts and labels. But in a world where the authority of the consumer rather than provider is so celebrated, in which what a visitor thinks of a work of art is considered as important, if not more so, than what an artist or curator thinks, I can see, and I'm actually quite comfortable with the idea, that this is unlikely to be a successful long-term prescription. This brings me neatly to my present concerns as director of the Art Fund and their relationship to this subject of connoisseurship now. I'm not going to assume, for I've discovered on previous occasions that this can be very dangerous, that everyone here knows exactly what the Art Fund is. It's the National Art Collections Fund. It was founded in 1903 with the principal aim of providing and raising money to help museums buy works of art, and is funded principally, and indeed as a point of principle, from public subscription and receives no government funding. Very little has changed about this formula in essence across the century of our existence. Museums come to us telling us what they want to acquire, asking us for a grant towards it, and sometimes assistance in fundraising for it too, as in the case of Van Dyck, and our trustees agree or otherwise to help. In two fundamental ways, this process is bound up with what one might call an adherence to traditional connoisseurial values. First, the decision makers, the trustees, the people who determine through this process which works of art museums should acquire, are principally, certainly not exclusively, art experts with advanced connoisseurial skills. Second, the normal rule is that before a grant is given, the work in question must be brought into the room and discussed at first hand by the decision makers. So with metaphorical and sometimes actual white gloves and monocles and glasses of port, a port is always metaphorical, the perceived qualities of the object are debated and the conclusion reached. Now, I'm exaggerating obviously slightly for fun, but we have here an essentially traditional process in which connoisseurial considerations have always dominated. Quality, often undefined, is the watchword, and the sense of responsibility about whether a work deserves to be in a public collection is never very far from the room. Interestingly, and somewhat problematically, the curatorial arguments put forward by the museums in support of their applications are very often pitched at quite a different level from the discussions and concerns of the trustees themselves. Younger curators, those whose art historical training has been based less on connoisseurship than on broader cultural studies, don't always, not only do not always speak the same language as the trustee funders who will determine the outcome of their application, but their most basic curatorial concerns may be wholly different. An object may not be beautiful, rare, conventionally important, or by a well-known artist, and so on, and yet for a curator may be highly desired for the way it can be deployed in a display or shed light on a thematic concern or match the needs of, well, their customers, the visiting public. It might even be said that curators are developing new kinds of connoisseurial skills in which what they know about the object is, as it were, matched up front to the wider lessons it can impart, rather than as an afterthought. Acquisitions are made with specific purposes in mind, usually connected to a public-focused curatorial agenda, rather than on the more traditional and generalized grounds of importance. However, I've been very heartened to see that my trustees make the leap from their own subjective standards about quality in art to meet the newer thinking of younger curators very readily indeed. Connoisseurship mostly is not a stranglehold or constriction any longer, but a vital reference point. And as I mentioned earlier in relation to Tate Modern, when it comes to the realm of contemporary art, connoisseurship is itself adapting fast. It's greatly to my regret that, because I was deemed to have a conflict of interest, I was not allowed to take part last year in my trustees' discussion about whether or not to give a grant to help Tate acquire Martin Creed's work number 227, which I'm sure you'll all know is The Lights Going On and Off in 2000. But by all accounts, it was a deeply focused debate in which the claims of the work of art, I can't say object because of course in that instance there was none, were forensically measured and a generous grant duly given, notwithstanding the heat of the surrounding discussion. So I think that the Art Fund now answers that key question, what it is ultimately that matters or is valuable about a work of art, in a way that's noticeably different from the connoisseurial tenets of the past. And its development in this respect seems to me to be healthy, some might say pragmatic in its response to new kinds of curatorial ambition and assumption. But we do so in parallel with a very real concern that curatorial skills in their widest sense are not valued as highly as they used to be, that curatorial numbers are declining fast, that museum cutbacks through financial pressures are disproportionately affecting curatorial strength, and that if we do nothing in many museums, and I'm speaking here principally about non-national regional museums, curators will disappear, replaced by caretakers and visitor services staff alone. So what kind of skills, might we ask, should a 21st century museum curator have, and how are we going to ensure that they're acquired? With regard to the latter, the answer partly lies with money, and I may say the Art Fund is doing its bit financially in supporting junior curatorial training programs at the National Gallery and the V&A in partnership with regional museums. Through our Jonathan Ruffer curatorial grant scheme, which is designed to support curatorial research and travel, and through some new strands of grant giving yet to be announced, whereby we will aim to award acquisition grants to selected young curators to enable them to build up skills in acquisition making in particular. At the Art Fund, as you might expect, we believe that tomorrow's curators should be as passionate and knowledgeable about collecting as yesterday's curators evidently were, even if some of today's seem not to be, their ambitions blunted by economic constraints. But this does not mean that yesterday's core curatorial skills, those of object connoisseurship broadly speaking, are on their own the right blueprint for the future. And I'm pleased to say that, for example, in the National Gallery Art Fund scheme that I mentioned, exhibition making, interpretation, and specific attention to visitor expectations are as much part of the curriculum as building knowledge in attribution, style, technique, and so on. And there's a strong connection, too, with conservation, matching the developing academic trend in which a profound focus on the physical structure of the object is once again recognized as being compatible, at least potentially, with adventurous interpretative scholarship. Well, I wonder if the landscape that I am now painting, or the garden that I'm planting, I'm not sure the best metaphor, might be looking a little bit too rosy, for I do seem to be describing a world in which the value or otherwise of connoisseurship is now a matter of consensus. Those unhappy disputes are memory only from the distant past. I do take quite an optimistic line, it's true, for I think there is much uniting the art world's various factions in this area, and that's something, as I see, as positive, even though I can't promise it will necessarily emerge universally or very quickly in today's discussions. But equally, there's no point in ignoring where tensions and sharp differences still lie on how much connoisseurship now matters. For those in the art trade, connoisseurship obviously does matter a great deal. Attribution, rediscovery of lost masterpieces, and so on are clearly the paths to prosperity. Unlike curators and academics, art dealers are not in this for the public service, of course. They tend to be good connoisseurs because their livelihood vitally depends on those particular kinds of skills of the eye especially. Meanwhile, they tend to have great respect and usually good relationships with the more traditional kinds of museum curator, especially those whose principal art historical training predated or sidestepped the academic progress and change in the discipline from the late 1970s. They often don't have very much time for progressive contemporary academics whose intellectual concerns are obviously more ambitious than establishing authorship or value. And you do sometimes come across the spectacle of an art dealer baffled, declaring that modern academic history is just jargon-laden nonsense. Academics, meanwhile, are engaged in a certain amount of infighting in this area to keep them busy too. There are still essentially connoisseurial art historians at large in university departments, some of them using the material culture smokescreen, I think, to ply an old trade in the guise of a new one. And of course, there are still many traditional curators in museums for whom today's academic art history is frankly petrifying. Occasionally, they reassert old values defiantly, and from time to time, you'll see an exhibition curated with techniques and approaches that predate the emergence of history as a serious academic discipline, offering the public a self-referential connoisseurial rhetoric that is in danger, ultimately, of looking self-indulgent rather than generously educative. To end, and to make sure I annoy everyone in the room except just the few that I've managed so far, I want to offer some very patronizing advice on the subject of connoisseurship to three of the principal constituencies I mentioned at the beginning and have just picked up again on the trade, the academy, and museums. And my unsolicited advice centres on the desirability, generally, of them communicating more consistently and generously with each other. To those in the art trade, I would say you will ultimately benefit greatly from continuing to help and support museum curators from time to time. I say continuing because although I may have implied a few moments ago that the public-spirited dealer is a dying species, I actually know that not to be the case. So I would say to them, please do keep on doing those practical favours, giving special opportunities or special discounts, offering free advice, and generally helping to put your connoisseurial skills, which you understandably usually concentrate on turning into financial gain for your own businesses, to the public good. You will thereby be on the side of the angels, rewarded in heaven, and it may also give you the right to pontificate on the subject of connoisseurship in public service, which otherwise you honestly don't have. You should also join the Art Fund, which puts many millions of pounds a year, raised, as I said earlier, from individual members of the public directly into your trade, but receives nothing in return. I won't embarrass those here by asking which of you are Art Fund members, that I fear very few. But to return to my principal homily, as well as doing more to help museums, I would also urge you to listen and learn from today's new breed of curators and university academics, rather than fearing or scorning them, as you may sometimes be tempted to do. For they're more likely to be more expert on the subject of what it is that actually matters about a work of art, in terms of how it relates to historical narrative or the most recent state of scholarship. And remember that art has financial value in the end only because it's understood by buyers to have cultural value. And museums and universities are where cultural value is defined, not in your showrooms. You need these guys. To academics, I would say embrace, of course, the underpinning of connoisseurship to art history, and where academic adventurousness can be combined with the practice of those more traditional skills, as perhaps we'll hear later today that they are sometimes being done, that's good and exciting. The days when connoisseurship was widely despised by academics as being anachronistic, reactionary, and nothing to do with intellectual endeavour at all, those days are past, or more or less so. There was once a dull cliché put about by those who felt most under threat from the new art history that the object had fallen out of fashion. Most students now, I think, are actually highly engaged with the object. Of course, they're not tolerant of the vestiges of the old snobbishness that used to accompany object knowledge, and they're more inclined to see the connections between an object from the past and the culture of the present, but that is very much to be welcomed. As for what those in the academic sphere might do in relation to museums, I would, of course, continue to advocate that you should consider how museums might be a great forum for exploring your own ideas, both in active relation to individual works of art, and for translating them into a context where they might have meaning and currency beyond your normal peer group and indeed into the realm of the broad public. If nothing else, your paymasters would be very pleased about that. There's no reason that the old divide deriving from that 1980s world of two art histories should have become anything other than nowadays than a mutually beneficial partnership of two disciplines that nonetheless remain firmly and healthily distinct from one another. What would I say about connoisseurship to the final group, the one that I probably know best, the museum curators? Nurturing and deepening dialogue and exchange with both university art history and with the art trade is clearly the priority here. However, there are still some pockets of the museum world, quite baggy pockets actually, that, as I mentioned, are resistant to both. There are still curators who, armed with great connoisseurial skills, try to pretend that art history is still pretty much the same as it was a generation ago, who think that all you need is a good eye and a pile of factual data about an artist or subject or group of works, and you can make a meaningful exhibition. As I've described, I tried in my time in museums to ensure that all exhibitions should incorporate new ideas and scholarship, even in instances where other curators weren't that keen to do so. That sometimes brought a bit of tension into proceedings, but I like to think that was a good thing, helping to bring about fresh views and understanding of sometimes wearisomely familiar subjects and artists. I happen to think it's just not worth making shows that haven't got something adventurous to say. And I continue to think that most curators would benefit from spending a bit more time exposing themselves to what's going on in the academic history of art and other disciplines at any given time. But if some curators are, in truth, frightened of academics, just as many fear the art trade. One of the sad effects of the decline in curatorial numbers and acquisition budgets in the UK is that today's curators spend a lot less of their time in their working days thinking about potential acquisitions and talking to dealers. There are even some very experienced curators in major museums who have very little to do with the art trade at all, an unthinkable idea a few years back. Dealers are often the best connoisseurs, and their knowledge about the object as well as the market is a huge resource ready with their kind collaboration to be tapped. Finally, I think it hardly needs saying that most serious art history would be impossible without the basic outputs of connoisseurship from which to draw. Who is a work of art by, when, how and where was it made, what is its stylistic context, and so on. Nor is it honestly contentious, I think, to say that knowledge of these things alone is not a form of significant cultural capital in itself, any more than in essence is knowing one train, stamp, bottle of wine or classic car, as I mentioned earlier, from another. The cultural value of art, and thus, as it happens, broadly speaking, the financial value too, emerges from moving on from the starting point of connoisseurship to understanding why and how art has interacted with history and ideology and the progress of society. And that, of course, is the point and purpose of proper art history. Connoisseurship and its association with notions of taste and, as Grayson Perry, borrowing from Freud, put it, the vanity of small differences, do still underpin the art world and do fundamentally inform the thinking of all those non-homogeneous art world constituencies with which I began. Connoisseurship is not a marginalized or dying art, but a powerful force. We should happily recognize its strength and be completely honest about its limitations. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Stephen, for that hugely impersonal and objective view of the role of connoisseurship, especially at the Tate and the Art Fund. Yeah, if you can do, or yeah, we'll probably say that. Thanks. Certainly, I think most of us, for better or worse, will recognise ourselves in some part of Stephen's talk, especially those of us who've maybe been around for some time. I myself was educated in the late 1970s, and I remember the huge impact that the so-called new art history had, and it was certainly, going back, a jolt. In some ways it was a welcome jolt, and sometimes it was a very uncomfortable ride. I particularly remember, and some of you were there, the Reynolds Conference at the Royal Academy in 1986, which got very amount of vigorous debate. Well, I hope we have a lot of vigorous debate today, but perhaps in a more friendly environment. And Sarah is here, and I don't know whether you've had any questions yet, Sarah. Have you?
No questions coming yet.
She'll be keeping us informed of anybody who's tweeting or getting in touch with us. So, but I think since we're all here in the room, I'd just like to throw it open. We've got a good 10 minutes or so plus for questions. So if anybody'd like to. There's a mic here at the front, so if you'd like to ask a question or make an observation, particularly with regard to, obviously, what Stephen's just been talking about, then here we are. And maybe if you could identify yourself as well, that would be very useful.
Thank you very much. I'm Penny Wilson, just, somebody who is deeply interested. It strikes me that connoisseurship for old art objects is very much easy because you see where it is leading to. With contemporary art, you've only got 50% of that. You understand the influences that have caused it to be made, but there is nothing yet to go forward into. Therefore, as I see it, a dealer is interested in promoting that artist's work, but there is no connoisseurship that he can offer as to where it might go. I don't know what anybody else thinks about that.
Yes, I mean, it's about this question of the sort of subjectivity, I think, of connoisseurship in a way, and objectivity, I suppose you could say, more easily comes with time, and so that we are all more certain in our categorization and commentary on works of art that have been around for a long time and around which a huge context has developed. If you walk into an artist's studio and see a work of art freshly completed, it's very difficult to initially to say anything particularly intelligent about it. The longer you spend with it and the longer you see it in the world, the more sophisticated your analysis becomes. I think that's a truth that we all struggle with, particularly when museums that contain contemporary art alongside, in their collections alongside historic art, are wont to treat contemporary art in exactly the same way, and are wont to accord the objects exactly the same kind of attention and kind of analysis, which isn't always appropriate.
And can I continue with that? Being a member of the NACF.
Excellent.
Can I just ask you how your trustees take that into account? Because obviously anybody who has collected art in the past, well, the trouble now is there is that future value that it might have. In the past, the patrons were rich enough to be able to say, I like that, I like that, I like that, without considering where the value would go. That must have some bearing now on what your trustees are considering.
Well, they do. They agonize over all their decisions, but I think it's probably fair to say that they agonize most over the decisions around contemporary art. I mean, I mentioned the debate around the lights going on and off as the most challenging decision they've probably had to make. I think one should all accept that collecting in the contemporary arena is a very risky business. Museums feel it keenly, we as a funder feel it, but you have to do it, and you have to accept that there may be failures along with the successes. And of course you have to try and, if it's possible to do so, set yourself apart from contemporary orthodoxy, and as we all know, the history of collecting is absolutely littered with examples of works of art that were acquired and thought to be absolutely ghastly, Whistler, Millet's Christ in the Carpenter's Shop. I mean, the list is absolutely endless. So they engage with contemporary collecting with caution and concern, but they take it very seriously, and all of the trustee discussions around contemporary art are incredibly focused, and I would like to reassure my members, responsible.
Thank you. Any other questions? We've got to, yeah.
Hi, I'm Emanuele Lugli from University of York. I was struck by your comments about harmony and the fact that today in the art historical world, lots of young curators as well as art historians actually are quite afraid to put forward new proposals for new interpretations as well as new attributions, because they don't want to necessarily alienate museums as well as professors and big scholars. So I find quite a devastating impact. The economic uncertainty of the market and the art historical world has some sort of psychological effects and curbs the enthusiasm for of younger connoisseurs for putting forward something that may be perceived as a risky move. I wonder whether you got any thoughts about this.
Yes, I mean, one would love to think that any person with a great idea will be listened to regardless of their age or status along the path of their careers. I think certainly in terms of the art trade, I think anyone who has a great idea and then makes a clever spot, is going to be welcomed. Their opinions are going to be taken very seriously. I think it's certainly true in museum exhibition making that there are some brilliant younger scholars coming up fast who in the past I think have been overlooked by some of the big institutions because they didn't appear to have the kind of gravitas and sense of judgment in order to make a great show. But I think increasingly these projects in museums are the result of collaborations, and I think it is often quite possible for emerging scholars to find a platform. I'm probably not close enough anymore to the kind of academic end to know whether smart students with great ideas are pompously put down by their professors or whether their ideas are welcome. Ask the person to your right.
We have a question there. I think Johnny Yarker.
Hi, Johnny Yarker from Lower Libson Limited. You said a couple of times rather casually a good eye, as though it was something innate, something that you're either born with or you're not. The reality is, I think everyone here who would sort of self-profess to have an eye or not, it takes a hell of a lot of training. And because that training has migrated away from the universities and to a large degree away from museums, it's a case of autodidacticism. And that's part of the problem, that some of the responsibility has been ceded away. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yes, I don't really know what more to say on the subject. I mean, you know, I used the phrase the eye somewhat ironically, I suppose, because I think it's in itself quite a kind of casual way of describing what is a very complex skill, a skill that isn't actually all quite as objective as the notion of sight, looking through an eye, might suggest. There is a lot of subjectivity. There are notions of taste and so on which intervene. I mean, I do find it a matter of regret, as I hope I've hinted, that you know, the vital skills of connoisseurship are confined so squarely on the sort of trade end of the spectrum, and in some of the smaller museums, and I'm certainly not talking about the larger ones, where the kind of breadth of curatorial skill tends to be so extraordinary. You know, I do think it's a matter of regret that those skills aren't better spread out. I mean, I hope we'll hear from others later today about how university education and how about the practice of art history addresses this question of how the eye becomes educated. Sorry, that's a slightly inadequate answer to a very important question.
Thank you. I just want to say something following up from Johnny, but also something as well, Stephen, that you mentioned quoting Grayson Perry.
Sorry, can you just...
Sorry,
am
I not speaking loudly
enough? It's just that you just say who you... I know.
Oh, sorry, I didn't say my name, sorry. My name is Annie Lyles, and I work on Constable, and I apologise for mentioning a Constable issue, but of course we all need to bring our personal examples into the debate to hopefully make a contribution. But Stephen had mentioned a quote of Grayson Perry's about the vanity of small differences. And I would argue that this isn't necessarily just a vanity. Of course, it could be if one's obsessing about, I don't know, a tiny stroke in the lower left-hand corner of one painting and go on about this for 25 minutes, and it makes no difference whatsoever. But in the Constable world, Leslie Paris, who of course was educated and developed his eye, so to speak, through experience, as Johnny mentioned, and at the date, ended up with Ian Fleming Williams defining an entire body of work that actually wasn't by Constable at all, and this was all based on very small differences indeed, and the work, of course, was by his son Lionel Constable. And they looked at one stage very similar, and we now know they're deeply distinct. And of course, nobody would argue that that distinction doesn't also have huge cultural value, because we can't simply assess what Constable's about if we don't know what the work is. And I just wondered what you thought, therefore, about the significance of these small differences, because they can actually have huge impact on an artist's work, which could have potential interest in terms of further academic debate as well, if one's assessing the wrong pictures.
I'm a complete advocate and supporter of the idea of the small difference in the work of art, and the basic output of connoisseurship, as I said, knowing whether a work is by one artist by another, is fundamental to any additional, or is usually fundamental to any additional line of inquiry. So I fully support that. I cited Grayson Perry's, I think, rather clever phrase, the vanity of small differences, not in relation to connoisseurship, but in relation to taste, in particular the idea of taste. And it is true, it seems to me a clever way of describing that the difference between something that society might judge as being in good taste and bad taste can often be differentiated by the most minute detail. And it is usually the smallness of the difference that lies behind the categorization.
The only comment I'd make on that, because it's now 10:30 and time for a coffee, is that perhaps later on the debate will take us into the territory of the perhaps quite subtle distinction, which of course we're trying to make today, between connoisseurship and attribution. And I think, as you mentioned there, that they really are not the same thing, because connoisseurship has this laden baggage of taste, but attribution, hopefully we all agree, is indeed essential, because it is the kind of fundamental science of working out whether something's right or wrong.
Yes, I mean connoisseurship for me is a attribution is a subset of connoisseurship. Yes.
But distinct from it nevertheless.
Thank you. I think we have time for another question, if somebody would like to. I think this question of taste is interesting. Just the other day I was shown a very large drawing by an artist that I don't really have very much time for, John Bradby. But it was very interesting, and it set me to think about the fact that, you know, when you've got an artist who is, perhaps I was thinking it's just as important to be able to identify what I regard as a good Bradby and a bad Bradby, even if I don't think much of it. And also with an artist like Bradby, unlike Constable, whatever one's view, one can't ignore the fact or omit the fact that he is actually rather important in terms of the cultural period in which he lived. And it's interesting how these things are not mutually exclusive. You know, whether you appreciate an artist or a work of art, or whether you want to put it in a social context, it seems to me it's inevitable that you have to do both. And I think certainly that's one of the good things that's come about in the last 40 years, is people are a lot more easy in moving around between these two. And Mark mentioned the new connoisseurship, that people can take a very close interest in an object or a set of objects without feeling that they're myopic, but also feeling much more comfortable about talking about them and giving them a context. And I think there is lots to be encouraged about in that. Well, what do you think? It's 10:30, coffee's all ready, and we might as well speak to schedules. Thank you so much, Stephen, for setting us off on a very thoughtful and personal and subjective track. So let's break. We've got half an hour, I think. Is that right, Mark? And we'll be back here at 11 o'clock, and we hope those of you who are not with us in the room will join us then. Thank you.